Okay, so hi again, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the NeuroAI Emerging Leaders webinar series. Following the success of the first NeuroAI workshop at NeurIPS 2024 last year, Furuk and I, with the generous support of Professor Adil Razi, decided to launch this webinar series to continue the conversation and provide a platform to learn from and engage with early career researchers and emerging leaders in the field of NeuroAI. Today, we are fortunate to kick off this series with our first speaker, Aran Nayebi. Aran is an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon University's Machine Learning Department, a member of the Neuroscience and Robotics Institutes. His lab, the NeuroAgents lab, works at the intersection of neuroscience and AI to reverse engineer animal intelligence and build the next generation of autonomous agents. Previously, he was a postdoctoral fellow at MIT, and before that, a PhD student at Stanford University with Dan Yamins and Surya Ganguly. Aran, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and we are very much looking forward to your talk. Whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction. Let me share my screen. And do you see my screen? Are you able to see it? Okay.
Yes, it's on presenter mode, basically. Yeah, we
Oh,
can.
okay. Okay. Let me stop the share. Actually, let me do it here. Okay, how about that?
We can still see the notes. And,
Oh, okay. Yeah. I usually don't present with notes, but for some reason it shows. Just give me a sec. Oh, okay, here. Got it. How about now?
all good now. Great.
Awesome. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. So as you can see, I actually slightly changed the talk title as I kind of like thought about what to talk about. It kind of made more sense to maybe emphasize, especially for the context of this type of series, maybe a broader theme of sort of my own speculations of where maybe I think the field of neuro AI could be heading. And in particular, as was mentioned, the name of my lab is the NeuroAgents Lab. And so today, maybe I'll make the case for a little bit of why neuro AI might need to become something more like NeuroAgents and need those sorts of things. And also what types of outcomes having that type of neuro agent and what that is would yield. So to start with, as a form of motivation, I'll begin with the kind of like maybe especially for this community, the canonical kind of brain score plot where each dot is a convolutional neural network that's trained on ImageNet, and the comparison on the y-axis is the linear regressed neural predictivity onto macaque v4 and IT on the right. And the main point, after say about let's say a decade or so of doing these kinds of comparisons is accommodated, for example, by integrative benchmarking platforms like BrainScore, is that an interesting pattern emerges, right? So initially what happens is that the models are basically improving as you get better at the task, as ImageNet performance. But eventually past the point, what happens is that you end up getting very similar predictivities among very different CNN architectures. Now, at first glance, one could wonder, well, this is just one data set, is with a macaque that's fixating. Maybe there's just something particular about that data set that is leading to this change, and it's not maybe a more fundamental one. But one thing that's interesting is that not only are there similar predictivities on this data set among very different CNN architectures, but even work from in human occipitotemporal cortex, so the human analog, basically a visual cortex, on the natural scenes data set as benchmarked by Colin Conwell and other collaborators from Talia Kunkel and George Alvarez's groups at Harvard, shows that even between convolutional neural networks and vision transformers, so not only within the same architecture class, but different inductive biases, you see again similar predictivities in matching human occipitotemporal cortex responses. And now on a much broader range of natural scenes, which is because this is the natural scenes data set and a different species in humans, right? And so what to me this kind of overall trend, at least in vision, suggests is that perhaps new ideas are needed, right? Even in the case of vision transformers, right? They're effectively approximating a convolution by doing attention across image passages. And so ultimately, they're not only doing the same kind of similar approximate computation, but are also approximately learning similar representations in their mapping to the brain too. Now, where might we get new ideas? Well, there's kind of two primary sources, right? One is, of course, developing new models. And the other is also like, re-examining and maybe looking at the methodology. So regardless, it seems like we're sort of stuck in a local minimum of ideas. And for what I'm going to argue, I'm going to mostly argue is that it's going to be important to move in the models direction. But to do so, what I'm going to argue is that the methodology actually itself motivates that and actually suggests that we're saturating the current benchmarks when it at least comes to object recognition. So to do so, I'm going to first take a slight focus on methodology before then motivating and moving on to the models. So to determine the methodology, right? One thing to point out is that ahead of time, we don't have some a priori notion of what constitutes a good brain model in an absolute sense, right? So for decades, neuroscience had things like sparsity, energy efficiency, things like this, like predictive coding is another example. But these are all like facets of hypotheses, really, not necessarily completely grounded in empirical evidence. And then once we started to get better at collecting neural data, we started to develop metrics, measures of comparison between model activations and neural population responses. But one of the reasons we do that is because we don't actually know which any of these hypotheses are should be better matches to the brain ahead of time until we make the comparison empirically. Right? Because if we did know what it was, then we would just already put it in the model and be done already. We wouldn't go through all this trouble of validating so many models against brain data to try to understand what the patterns are that emerge. So we just actually had, motivated by this observation, we had a notion of what should constitute a ceiling when doing these model brain evaluations in what we call in a position paper with Janelle Feather, Meenakshi Khosla, and Ratan Murthy, the NeuroAI Turing test. And the basic motivation is that, even if we don't know the properties that make a good brain model, we know that, of course, animal brains and subjects' brains contain those desired properties, right? That's the target of our model brain comparison. So even if we can't describe them up front, we know that, brains contain these properties. And so our criterion is to take a relative perspective, namely that models should match the brain as good as two brains match one another. Because even if you hold fixed stochasticity in the brain, there's still going to be natural inherent evolutionary variability between two different individuals under the exact same circumstances. And the reason why it relates to a Turing test in particular is that in the original Turing test, the focus was on behavior, right? It was the idea that a machine, if it could convince a human evaluator on its outputs alone, its behavior, that it was a human, then as judged by the human, it's indistinguishable from one. But of course, two different things can cast the same shadow. So in the figure on above, you can do silhouette puppets that lead to what looks like a bunny, and an actual bunny could do that. So instead, at least as people who work in NeuroAI, we go one step further in general when we make these model brain comparisons, that we not only care about behavior is an important constraint and very important, and I'll be comparing to behavioral data in later portions of this talk, but we also, in addition, want to compare to internal representations and say that when we compare both behavior and internal representations, that we match the brain as good as two brains match each other. So what might this look like in practice? Well, I'll just kind of cartoon schematize some possible scenarios. So one is that, as you compute this brain-to-brain similarity score, where the bars are models and the horizontal gray line is that brain-to-brain score, that none of the models reach that similarity on the current, say, benchmark or data that you've collected. And so the conclusion then is to continue to refine models to improve on this benchmark. On the other hand, another possible scenario is, of course, that the models actually do reach or approach this brain-to-brain similarity, and that it's ultimately close to this ceiling, this NeuroAI Turing test. And so what that indicates then to do next is that it's saturated and one should move on to other benchmarks. I should also point out that in the left case scenario where the models don't reach brain-to-brain similarity, you can actually use this NeuroAI Turing test is actually a metric, it's a measure. And you can actually use it to do extrapolation analyses of what type of data to collect next. So for example, in the right, if you are saturating and you want to continue to push the models, it could tell you whether you need to collect more neurons or more stimuli. As one example of different dimensions of improving that, and then going and checking again whether you've saturated that benchmark. So let me give an example of this on real data. So one of the reasons actually we had this as a position paper was that a lot of us, I mean, especially myself, have been basically doing this since for a long time. And we just kind of never treated it as like gave great justification for it. It was always a supplemental figure. So as you see, this is the last supplemental figure in our convolutional RNN paper, where we looked at that data set, the HVM data set that I showed in the beginning with V4 and IT. In this case, this is IT's neural productivity. And we compare models, in this case, resonant 18s, at different time points in the IT data, with also varying the type of linear mapping of the number of components of PLS. So that's what you're seeing in on the x-axis. And the standard measure has been the statistical noise ceiling, which is the internal consistency of the neuron. So not how two animals' brains match to each other, but how a single neuron reproduces itself across trials. That's been the standard kind of measure of ceiling. So initially we thought we were quite far, but once we did the NeuroAI Turing test, the animal-to-animal consistency, where the statistical noise ceiling is actually a correction term on the denominator, and you can see our paper for more details of why that is a derivation. What you see is that actually the current models actually approach really more like 90% of the animal consistency ceiling. So the gray horizontal bar on top of each bar, and that's regardless of what time point you look at for the same model. That's regardless of what time point you look at and the hyperparameters of the mapping function. So this is important to point out because it means that we may have achieved it then for the kind of classic HVM data set. That one of the reasons we're saturating is that it's basically tapped out. There's a little bit of juice left, but it's primarily tapped out. We're at 90% of it. But what I'm going to show you is that even when you compute this measure of brain-to-brain similarity between animals, that in domains of embodied intelligence, i.e. in domains where we haven't even had great AI, but where the brain currently excels at, we're actually quite far with current state-of-the-art models from this NeuroAI Turing test. So now what I'm going to do then is, now that we've kind of motivated why we need new models, I'm going to switch to kind of motivate, in what direction we're going to push them, why in this embodied direction. Well, one motivation is just a kind of basic cognitive one, which is that, we know that not only us, but other animals do a lot more than passive viewing. So what I'm showing here are actually example ImageNet images, real ImageNet images. And all you're trying to do is basically look at this kind of like center cropped image with a fixed lighting and identify the category of the object that's in the center of that image. And that's like not the actual visual task that our visual system supports, right? So to give an example, right, we actually do much richer scene understanding in dynamic scenes where not only can we recognize them rapidly despite a variety of scenarios, we also see relations between objects, namely in this case that cars are supported by the road, people walk along the street, buildings and trees line the sidewalk, and all of these constitute a rich understanding of the scene. Furthermore, animals can make complex multi-step plans to attain desired targets. So here's a crow that's actually using a stick to grab food that it could not otherwise reach with its beak alone. They can also navigate effortlessly and explore novel environments. So depicted here is a top-down view of a rat in an open environment with the red dots indicating place cells that are firing in its hippocampus as it enters a particular location in its cage. And finally, animals can masterfully control their body with ease to interact with and manipulate their environment, greatly rivaling any robot we have today. So the critical thing is that all of these behaviors are done in a body, and they involve taking actions in the world and actively sampling them. And so what, I think as a field, we ought to be interested in is really what are the core design principles that give rise to these embodied abilities that involve active interaction and lifelong learning in the world. And what I'm going to show you across two different species and different brain areas is that there ends up emerging a kind of connection between performing visual tasks in out-of-distribution settings, learning a kind of general purpose representation for that, and being able to control a body flexibly in out-of-distribution scenarios. And in fact, the most neurally predictive models are those that link these two together: a general purpose visual scene understanding, visual representation with the ability to do this kind of flexible embodiment as best as we can currently today with current techniques. So to show you this, I'm going to focus on first studying case study in mouse visual cortex and self-supervised learning. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a change of species afterwards and go to a higher cognitive area in primates involving mental simulation and intuitive physical understanding. And then to end this talk, I'm going to end on some, high-level takeaways of patterns that maybe, that might be helpful that I've personally seen over the years about interrogating natural intelligence more broadly, and especially as we go into the Q&A session. So first, mouse visual cortex. So this was work that actually appeared a year and a half ago in PLOS Comp Bio and was co-led with Nathan Kong, as well as other collaborators, and along with Danny Emmons and Tony Norchub and Justin Gardner and Cheng-Shu Zhuang. So going back to the first plot that I showed you in the beginning, this is IT's neural predictivity versus object recognition accuracy in primates. What we see is a very nice, where each dot is a model, again, a nice correspondence between a neuroscience goal of explaining variation in neural population responses and AI goal of pushing more and more on object recognition accuracy, giving you a better model up to a point of saturation, right? An actual question to ask is like, what happens in the mouse? Well, in the mouse, it's like not very hierarchical looking, even like from neuroanatomy. So it already suggests something weird, right? Potentially. It might read out into something functional. In other words, the mouse visual cortex is kind of like a paw where V1 takes up a lot of the actual space. And then there's multiple parallel streams of higher order visual areas that read off on top of it. In fact, if I make the same plot for mouse visual cortex, where now it's on the Allen Institute NeuroPixels data involving passive viewing, what you find is that actually there is not actually a strong relationship between at least object recognition accuracy and neural predictivity. In fact, highlighted here are deep supervised CNNs. And in fact, as they get much better at this object recognition task, they end up becoming a worse mouse model. Instead, at a high level, what we found was we might ask, well, like, does task optimization actually apply to rodents? And at a high level, what we found was yes, but it just depends on the constraints. So in particular, the best models of mouse visual cortex were not deep CNNs, but shallow CNNs that were matching the fact that, mouse visual cortex is also shallower hierarchy, but they're crucially trained with a contrastive loss function. So a self-supervised objective that is similar or inspired by head motion. Namely, if I look at two different views of the same object, I'm going to call them the same thing, a positive example, and I'm going to differentiate them from views of different objects, so negative samples. And just to give a context, right, this paper came out a year and a half ago, but it was worked on for several years. And around the time we started the project, our lab, along with many others around the world, had just developed at least finally performant self-supervised loss functions. So in other words, there had to be over autoencoding, which is the kind of very dominant paradigm. There actually had to be an AI breakthrough for this to ultimately result in a much better mouse model. So now, having a contrastive network is old news, but just to put it in context of when we started. And one thing was once we had contrastive objectives that could actually work well, and then we compared them to mouse visual cortex and built a mouse model and saw that it was much better. we wanted to understand better, like what was the ecological reason why the mouse visual system might prefer self-supervision. And our hypothesis was that it was trying to learn a more task general representation, given the resource constraints it has of a much shallower cortex and lower visual acuity. So rather than kind of specialize really strongly on one task, it was just trying to make do with the little resources it has as much as possible. So one way we assessed this was basically to take our mouse model, but with a visual acuity matched version of ImageNet, and evaluate it on a reward-based navigation task that involves taking blue orbs. And so what this amounted to wasn't merely just evaluating it in a fixed setting, but actually to take the weights of our pre-trained vision network, our in silico mouse visual cortex, freeze them, and then drop them into a biomechanically realistic rodent body that was around that time had just recently been developed by Ben Solvecchi's group at Harvard, involving Josh Morell and Diego Alvarado and a few folks at DeepMind and their labs. And then what we did was we trained, after we held those weights fixed, we trained a decision-making policy, an RL policy on top to then grab these blue orbs. So it got reward every time it did that. So here what I'm showing is after training what the first person egocentric view of this rodent is with this policy. And you can see it goes and grabs the orbs, and then it gets reset once it does that. And it's grainy because this is actually matched to as best as we could to the biophysical visual acuity of the rodent. So I want to emphasize that this isn't just out of distribution in that it's new statistics. It's not the visual part of this is not trained on, but it also is a new task. It involves now being able to control a high degree of freedom body, keeping track of history over long time scales with high dimensional continuous inputs. And what we saw overall is that compared to the same exact architecture, same data set, but all we're changing is whether it's a self-supervised contrastive objective or a supervised category optimized objective, categorization objective in black, that the contrastive one transferred better to this reward-based navigation task. We also went the other way, just as another way to assess transfer performance, where now we trained on the contrastive maze task with the contrastive loss on the maze images. And the supervised version was end-to-end RL, basically. And then we evaluated how well it could do on new scenes at the same visual acuity. So these involve tasks like pose estimation, position estimation, size estimation, categorization at this lower visual acuity, texture recognition. And in all cases, the contrastive models were outperforming the specialized supervised ones. We also asked, do these contrastive models that task generalize better also match neurons better overall? So what we did was we held fixed the data set and the architecture, and what we varied was the loss function between contrastive learning, supervised learning, and reinforcement learning. And what we see is that contrastive loss is better than the supervised or RL loss in the same environment. So in other words, if you do end-to-end reinforcement learning and learn a visual encoder that way from scratch on this maze environment, the contrastive objective is better at matching neurons than end-to-end RL. And I'm going to re-emphasize this point in the next section. But the main takeaway for now is that, as far as we understand it, it's mouse visual cortex is a low acuity, shallow network that makes best use of the mouse's limited resources to create a general purpose visual system that can then be deployed in novel environments and crucially better in embodied contexts. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to again show you a similar relationship between self-supervised learning and embodiment, now in videos and time, but applied to a higher cognitive area and in primates now rather than rodents. This was a Nerve Spotlight paper that also appeared about a year and a half ago and was done in collaboration with Mehrdad Jazaeri's group and Rishi Rajalingam, who collected the monkey data, and Robert Yang, both of whom I did my postdoc with at MIT. And the motivation was that, like, so far we've talked about object recognition, right? But we could do far more than just like recognizing the objects in the scene. In fact, if I show you this image of two ice blocks, one on the left, one on the right, you can infer semantic things that go beyond what's actually in these pixels. So for example, you can infer based on your knowledge of temperature and physical dynamics that the ice block on the right has been out longer than the one on the left. My cat can also predict whether this box will support her before she gets on. And just by looking at this image, I can also plan intervening actions of how I would take these hats off the rack. And this, of course, is not restricted to static scenes, but also applies to dynamic ones. So if I show you this fluid hitting an unseen object, you can probably infer that that unseen object was a staircase, just as though almost like it was there. You could simulate it. And so the kind of puzzle here was to better understand the functional constraints that enable the brain's future simulation-like computations across diverse environments. And so what I mean by functional constraints is that they abide by kind of three principles that animals and humans have to deal with, which is basically that they can take in unstructured visual inputs across a range of phenomenon. We don't give them handcrafted inputs or the ground truth simulator state. They take in raw pixels, and they then generate physical predictions from those raw pixels of what's going to happen in the future. And in going from inputs to outputs, they also consist of internal neural representations, artificial units that we can then compare to real biological units from real brain data of animals mentally simulating, in this case, primates. And so we codify these three kind of requirements into what we call sensory cognitive networks, just to simply have a name. And they fall under three broad classes, which I'm going to explain in a moment. But the main thing is that because these three broad classes of future predicting models are image computable, we can apply them to a variety of different data sets, both in held out scenes involving collection of human behavioral data, but also completely out of distribution scenes like in Pong here on the right, and compare to detailed neural activity collected from primates. So it gives us a lot of flexibility as a result by having this kind of image computable model. So now I'm just going to kind of explain what these hypotheses are in the context of the neural data. So again, just to crucially emphasize this point, we don't train on the stimuli that are shown here in evaluation, where they're trained in real world videos, and then we evaluate them on both of these, human behavior and macaque neurophysiological data. So the macaque data, the macaque is trained to do basically a task that Rishi trained them to do of mental Pong. So it's just like Pong, except the catch is that the ball gets occluded from view, so hidden from view. And in some of these trials, I'm actually showing you the ball a little bit, just so you get a sense of what it looks like. It's not actually shown to the macaque. And what the macaque has to do is, despite the ball actually being hidden from view, it has to modulate the paddle here with the joystick to intercept with that ball. And if it does that successfully, it gets a reward. And this involves 79 initial conditions of the ball. And Rishi collected data from true primates in a node of the intuitive physics engine in the brain known as dorsomedial frontal cortex, or DMFC. So this amounted to about a total of 1,889 reliable units that are recorded from DMFC for this mental Pong task. So now what I'm going to do is show you the same type of plot that I've been showing you before, where the y-axis is again model to brain neural predictivity. Now in DMFC, while the ball is being mentally simulated. So the core thing that Rishi and Merdad and colleagues found was that in DMFC, despite the ball being hidden from view, the animal was actually simulating the ball's position and velocity to be able to do this in time. And one thing you can see is, again, define a NeuroAI Turing test. At the time, we didn't have the name for it, but it's just basically the animal-to-animal consistency. And you see between two primates, while they're mentally simulating, their dorsomedial frontal cortex activity is quite consistent with one another. Now, of course, animals have to do a lot of other tasks than mentally simulate, even during this setting, right? DMFC can encode for timing of responses. It can encode for attentional demands, saccades, that sort of thing. So what we did was we defined a kind of perfect simulation oracle, which was the ground truth position and velocity of the ball when it's hidden from view, regressed against the neurons in time. And so what you see is a large portion of the variance is explained by that. So not all of it is due to mental simulation, but we're just interested at least in the part that's due to that. So now what we do is we're going to now start to compare models once we have our ceilings defined. The first is this pixel-wise feature prediction model, which takes in frames and at time t, and then predicts the next frame. So this is completely self-supervised, and because all it needs is just frames and no labels, and it computes the distance between its prediction x hat and the actual ground truth next frame from xt as the input. And there's also KL regularizer just to prevent overfitting. The main thing, though, I want to emphasize is that the types of future predictions that this type of loss function demands are at the level of individual pixels. So it's very detailed. And one thing you see is that, at least at the time with very state-of-the-art models, when we trained them on natural videos and then compared them in this Pong setting, they were quite poor models of the neurons, quite far from the perfect simulation oracle. And in fact, one thing you can do is take the best of these models in terms of task performance and actually visualize their predictions because they output a next frame prediction. And what we saw was that despite giving this set of input frames before it gets occluded as context to the model, the predictions were actually treating the ball as though it wasn't a moving object. So in other words, like the ball stops at the final input frame in the model's imagination. And this was the case even if I made the ball larger or change the shape to really make this like really obvious, and it would still fail in this OOD sense. So it's like sort of like if this was the type of physics predictor in our brains, that if we went to a new room, we suddenly forgot all the physics despite being trained in eons of different rooms. Right? This is a bad type of OOD generalization. And maybe the idea was that, well, okay, maybe this is happening, this kind of not machine learning overfitting, because it's doing fine on the test set of the same statistics, but doing poorly on this OOD generalization. Maybe this is because the pixel-wise loss is overfitting to the statistics of the scene. So perhaps instead, the MFC is predicting a factorized version of the scene. So how might it be doing that? And one idea was object slots. So basically you have K object slots and you're trying to predict for every scene, they're fixed. And then you're trying to learn future predicting dynamics on those slots, like with a graph neural network. And the nice thing is that this can actually be trained with a contrastive objective. So what I mean by that is that it can be trained in a fully self-supervised way where you're trying to have the kth object slot match in time in the future of the ground truth frame at the next time step, and also to repel against, in different video frames, for the same object slot to not contain the same objects, basically between different videos. So you can phrase this in a nice contrastive way, again, without requiring labels, because again, we don't learn about the world through labels. So that's why it's important that it can be done in a self-supervised way. But despite that, they again kind of poorly match neurons, even through different varying amounts of larger or smaller architectures in the encoder. So if it is predicting a factorized version of the scene, it's not by allocating fixed object slots. So instead, the next idea, the final idea, was what I call latent future prediction, which is that rather than like posit some explicit hand-built structure that we're still learning through, we instead learn a more implicit representation of the physical world by performing a challenging vision task, what we can call a foundation model. So the term foundation model, I think, was invented in 2021 at Stanford. So this is about a year or two after that. And they were starting to become more popular, especially in vision. And then what we're going to do is then future predict. We're going to hold fixed that foundation model, and then we're going to predict the future in the latent space. So the latent space is going to be the ground truth. So then the crux question becomes, well, what vision task should we pre-train on? So going back to like the static ones, right? We could start with these like ImageNet and see how far we get. And what we see is that all the image foundation models, despite not only just being on ImageNet, but even larger web scale data sets like that are 400 times larger than ImageNet, they all still similarly fail to predict the perfect simulation oracle all that well. Not much improvement. So they're useful for downstream static tasks. But given that we engage far more with these with dynamic scenes, around the same time that I started this project, Meta had just collected Ego 4D, which is where participants wear head-mounted cameras and go about their day performing everyday actions. And what people had found was that by training with a contrastive objective, so the same type of objective on static scenes that I showed you with the mouse, but now in time between consecutive frames, so pushed together frames that are close together in time from those that are far back in time, you can learn a representation that actually transfers well to a range of embodied tasks in held out scenarios. Better than, not perfectly, but better than ImageNet pre-trained models or static image ones, even for larger data sets. And what we found was these were finally the models that were starting to approach the perfect simulation oracle. And these are different model architectures I'm showing you that are trained on Ego 4D. And the main takeaway is that they're useful for embodied tasks. And we can ask, well, how much was the pre-training important? So this is all like future predicting in this pre-trained latent space. But if you do a control where you don't future predict, you get much worse performance. So pre-training on Ego 4D isn't enough to ensure this. You actually have to do this kind of explicit latent space future prediction to match DMFC. And furthermore, you can also, even if you do all that with Ego 4D and latent future prediction, if your pre-training objective is not SSL, but it's offline RL, you'd actually poorly match the neurons again. So again, we're seeing, just like in mouse visual cortex, that self-supervised learning is yielding a better neural model than a reinforcement learning based objective in these kind of more vision grounded tasks. So just to end this section, I mentioned that we don't just care about Pong, but other diverse environments. So because these models are image computable, we can actually compare them to human data. In this case, we looked at more realistic scenes with involving humans across 8 different scenarios of different types of objects. And the basic question that we query the humans and get yes/no answers from humans from 100 subjects is, well, will the agent object contact the patient object? So the agent object here is red, is the red domino, and the patient object is yellow. Here's a side view of the same scene. And you have to basically, the humans have to click yes or no before the scene ends. So they don't see the outcome, they have to predict it. It's a readout of their prediction. And what we see when we compare models against both the neural and behavioral metrics, right, which have different trade-offs, right? The neural data is very detailed neural activity, but on more simpler scenes. And the human behavior is a less detailed readout of yes or no, but on more complex scenes. If we try to find the model that can do best of both worlds, what we find the one is that best matches these so far is exposed to the largest variety of egocentric video sources and transfers the best across the widest range of embodied tasks. But again, we still have a ways to go. We're not perfect on either of these metrics, especially human behavior even. But we still have a ways to go to reach a NeuroAI Turing test here. And so I'm happy in the discussion to talk more extensively about better models. So at the moment, the takeaway is that mental simulation crucially relies on explicit feature prediction of a factorized description of visual scenes, where this factorized description is strongly constrained and must at least enable a wide range of dynamic embodied abilities. So again, not without forcing it, a relationship emerges between being a good neural model and having a good self-supervised representation that's then useful for embodied context, better than other models can before it. So I'm just in the last couple minutes, I'm just going to end on, if you'll permit me, some speculation on heuristics for interrogating natural intelligence. And what this comes from is from kind of breaking up, NeuroAI, it has both sort of terms, neuroscience and AI. There's really 2 sources of insights that we can derive from improving better models, is neuroscience and AI insights. So from incorporating neuroscience insights, they tend to come from 2 sources of data. Connectomics, which is very popular, especially recently, with Flywire, which is very heroic work, and ethology. One thing I didn't talk about was that actually we spent a lot of time in mouse visual cortex trying to build better models by improving the architecture from some connectomic or track data, really, of mouse visual cortex. But what we found was that actually it was very easy to get wrong because you could, to convert a connectomic model to a functional one. Because you could, for example, assume things where you had striated layering of layer 2, 3, layer 4, layer 5, and then you ended up with too deep of a model. So rather what we found was that the best model actually often requires an iterative balance of functional optimization, right task, right self-supervised objective in this case, with macro scale constraints. So not very detailed constraints, which get filled in anyway with the optimization objective, but macro scale constraints like having shallow cortex rather than deep network. The other one is ethology. So ethology alone doesn't always give us the correct functional optimization target. So for example, decision like RL signals, like reward, doesn't yield a better neural model, but instead this kind of intermediate goal of self-supervised general purpose representation learning seems to be better. And it can be helpful to consider that that brain area is embodied in a larger cognitive agent to do many other downstream tasks. And related to that, kind of the same notion, but from an AI point of view, is that end-to-end RL doesn't seem to give us neurally aligned visual systems in both rodents and primates. And what this might suggest is instead a type of functional modularization of optimization targets, where in vision, we might actually think that, or our best theory right now of sensory systems is self-supervised learning, and maybe downstream, closer to action, like the motor areas, an RL objective might be better suited. And so if we take these kind of like observations with some, at face value at least, some patterns emerge. So I'm just going to highlight of embodied agents, modularization, and so forth. So maybe what this suggests is that moving forward, we should have modularized embodied agents. And so one approach that we're pursuing as a lab is to build these agents with different modules that correspond to the sensory motor loop, and asking for one for each module, how does the brain represent, predict, plan, and enable action? So each highlighted red word corresponds to each of these modules. Now, I think that there needs to be some serious work, some AI, like algorithmic work, to like get these modules to like fit together well in terms of improving them from where they are right now, which I'm happy to talk about in the discussion section. But my main point is that once you have these hooked up, they also model the improved not only individual modules, but they're interacting. They're now a hypothesis for how brain areas interact to give rise to much more complex embodied behaviors. And each module separately would be, I'm color mapping it to a potentially corresponding area in, say, the rodent brain. A prediction of an individual brain area, and the agent as a whole is a prediction of how those brain areas interact. And as we're getting more and more whole brain data, especially in accessible animals that are like rodents, this ability to validate these types of embodied agents is much more feasible, actually, and in fact feasible today. And in fact, the practical outcomes of a type of NeuroAgents program is this follow. One is that, neural data is becoming more open source. So we would not only have the benchmarks be open source, but the models would be open source. So I'm a big believer in that, and always release model weights for that reason. But it could also be then used as a community effort to predict outcomes for new experiments, right? Running experiments in biology is hard and takes a long time, but it's much cheaper and faster when, thousands, if not millions of perturbations and changing the stimuli through a virtual model. From a neuroscience or like systems neuroscience point of view, it also allows you to engage with questions that you couldn't engage with before with the kind of individual brain area single module approach that we've taken so far in NeuroAI, where we're building better models of the visual system, or we're building better models of the language areas, or we're building better models of the motor system, but divorced from vision, right? Is that now that once you have these modules hooked up, once you have a single agent, you can start to ask questions about like what are the kind of hardwired intrinsic goals of that animals and humans pursue. So to illustrate this, right, in the success of reinforcement learning in games like chess and Go is that there was a well-defined external reward function, a score function. But the real world, the environment doesn't have that. And so instead, animals pursue intrinsic goals. And trying to study that is very crucial for building autonomous agents, even if you're purely an AI person. If you're more interested in the neuroscience side of things, it also enables you to study biological learning goals. So how these modules interact to allow for learning. So right now, we don't study things like development, and developmental data is very hard to get. But you could start to now posit a hypothesis for development, because where you pre-train the modules up to a certain point, that's your starting point. That's like kind of the evolutionary pre-training. And then you can start to posit updating rules for each of these modules, which would then you could compare those patterns of activity to real brain data. And we had papers in 2020 showing that population activity can separate learning rules. Finally, and last point is that it allows us to study species-conserved algorithms across modules. So principles of intelligence that are conserved in the sensory motor loop, because all animals, including us, do this. So in the long term, it wouldn't be necessarily just sticking to one animal or overfitting to any one animal, but rather studying and building artificial organisms. So here what I'm highlighting is different like rodent, macaque, and human brains with homologous brain areas color-coded to match that are involved in the sensory motor loop. These are just examples that are color-coded to match each of these modules. And with that, you can start to study species-conserved principles. And this is going to become more and more common as brain data, especially whole brain data, is coming online more and more rapidly. So we're starting to be in this kind of age, an era of larger and larger data sets. And this allows us to, this kind of NeuroAgents approach allows us to engage more faithfully with these data. With that, I'd like to thank you for your time and acknowledge both my collaborators, Stanford, MIT, and CMU, as well as my funding resources, in particular the Burroughs Wellcome Fund, which provides support for my lab. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Aran. I guess people are artificially thanking you as well in the chat box. That was a great talk. Thank you for your time. And I personally loved like the idea about modularized models that you mentioned, and to do, these modular objective functions. I think that's definitely necessary, given all the evidence that you mentioned that you've also found in your work. So I really love that part. And I guess we're now open to questions. Please feel free to unmute yourselves if anyone from the audience have any questions. Or if you're more comfortable, maybe just type in the chat box and we will try to ask our questions from Aran.
People are thinking about, oh, okay, there's some
Yeah,
Joe wants to.
Joe. By the way, welcome, Joe. I just noticed you're here in the middle of the talk.
I came a few minutes late, so I'm sorry about that. But great
Yeah, no,
talk. I
that's
think it's
fine.
very interesting. Yeah, I saw this paper come out. I guess it was late February, right? It's very interesting, and I'm kind of curious about, well, a couple of things. So this is not, your framework is not tied into a particular metric, right? For kind of this Turing test aspect, right? As far as you're giving a degree of freedom to users of the NeuroAI Turing test to find whatever metric kind of gives them the sharpest distinction to find these modules, right? So I mean, is there a danger there in kind of enabling not like p hacking, or kind of like a garden of approaches and then multiple comparison difficulties? I mean, how do you think about that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So, the way I think about it is that I think every scientific question, I don't think there is I think there's an implicit like assumption, even in myself, especially doing this, that there's some kind of like platonically good single metric that we should all agree on as a community, and maybe there is for many questions, right? And I'll mention one in particular shortly. But I think by and large, though, the brain is a complex object, and also not only just the brain, but almost any scientific endeavor, like say chemistry, for example, like people are looking at different aspects of these like physical systems, and therefore their questions are going to require different degrees of separability and different metrics to that will be appropriate and suitable there. So the idea was to basically provide that flexibility that if you pick some metric, that you also measure the brain-to-brain similarity there under that metric. So that metric is actually not optimized to match any one model, to make one model match the brain well. It's actually optimized, or you end up looking at the measure that is actually trying to maximize the brain-to-brain similarity, so that you have like a strong benchmark to be able to then separate models with that given metric. So that's how it kind of like helps with the kind of like p hacking thing that you're mentioning. Though I will say that, like, oftentimes in my work, so I didn't show this in this talk, but like in the papers themselves, I often look at multiple metrics, and at least the metrics that we've so far come to some informal consensus on in the field, like PLS regression or ridge regression and RSA, for example, at a macro level in terms of like, say, loss function classes. So like not flavors of, say, contrastive learning, like particular flavors, but there's contrastive versus autoencoding versus, that this sort of families. I've found across, at least in these data, across species and in other data, for them to largely agree. So my kind of like, while that's a nice thing, my kind of preference, though, if it's like a personal preference, is that whenever I'm starting in a kind of new brain area, by new I mean not in vision anymore, but like in like, say, other modalities, right? Where there's zero models because we just haven't figured out the behavior, like built a model that was good or done the comparison, that you define that the metric that I tend to use is still linear predictivity. One of the reasons for that is that it's often better to just have a linearly predictive model over zero models that weren't, right. And furthermore, there's like also like an engineering applicability of this type of measure, is that once you have like gotten a decent linearly predictive model, oftentimes that can yield a model that you can then backprop through, because you've learned weights to do neural population control. So like one kind of like, to be a slightly philosophical about it, it's like, one test of an understanding that a theory provides is whether of a particular natural phenomenon is how well it can also control that phenomenon. And so, like, for example, like quantum physics gives us the ability to like build reactors that can then control these with high degrees of fidelity. We're not there yet with the brain, obviously. I mean, in some benchmarks we are, but not all of them. And ideally, like if we had a full theory of the brain, we would have a match of that kind of ability across many scales. So, but my preference is to start with metrics that are result in that controllability. But we leave that open as long as we just wanted a well-defined ceiling under any choice of metric suited for that particular scientific question.
Yeah, thanks. That makes sense. You're kind of grounded by the brain-to-brain comparisons. That makes yeah.
Thank you so much, Aran. I guess we have another question in the chat box. It's asking, what's your opinion on interaction between agents and communication to uncover how these modules interact with each other?
Yeah, so I think that to get those modules to interact, I think there still needs to be some advances in basically improving each of them. So here, let me see if I can show you. Yeah, that's this slide. So I kind of highlighted what these questions are. So like I think the big let me just try to summarize these are more detailed questions, but let me that I'm highlighting here on the slide, but let me summarize maybe the three bigger advances that we kind of may need. One, I think, is in the motor control aspect of things. I'm a big believer in hierarchical motor control, and like getting that working with RL right now is quite sample inefficient. So there's that kind of embodiment, and there's a lot of cues we can already get from neuroanatomy there, I think, that can actually be helpful. Very repeated, for example, structures, central pattern generators, to give one idea, that you don't need much parameter tuning because by default they're oscillators. So when put in a quadruped, they already start to move forward. Anyway, so there's lots of like priors that like nature has that make these things great. I mean, horses can walk within 4 hours. So there's very strong structure that I think might be helpful there. If we could auto-discover that, that'd be great. Another aspect of the modules that should be important, as I mentioned in the second part of the talk, like mental simulation or future inference. Right now, where the models, all the state-of-the-art models that I've tested so far fail currently are when it comes to interactions, predicting interactions between rigid and soft objects of different material properties. So for example, like if a cloth was to fall on this water bottle and drape over it, humans are much better at predicting that than current models are. And there's a correlation between better matching human error patterns and doing better on this prediction task. So we're still far from saturating that, especially for different material properties. The thing is that Ego4D and these other data sets have plenty of examples actually of different material properties. Like there's lots of things with people cooking in a kitchen, dealing with dough, dealing with clay, that sort of thing. So it's not that it's not really there, it's that the loss functions, like the self-supervised contrastive objectives right now, I think are just not picking up on it. So in other words, it's like, I think potentially moving to, and I mentioned vision transformers being similar to CNNs. And one reason for that is that like the patches right now are they're just kind of random like patches. They're not like very semantically linked with the notion of a token in vision, like it is in language where individual constituents like words have semantic content with them. So I think for us, like that notion is like objects and object centricity. So if we can kind of combine a little bit of that object centricity, maybe with dynamic object slots rather than fixed ones or something like that, with things that do scale well on dynamic scenes, with loss functions that do operate with more structure but scale, I think that can move things forward. So in terms of world modeling, I think there's architectural advances that need to be made that can improve this. And then lastly, related to goals, that's the third one. So it's embodiment, world modeling, and adaptive autonomy that I think are the three kind of major areas that are going to be important in terms of individual module improvement. Is that like trying to get goals where the animal or the agent doesn't perseverate on intrinsic goals that don't perseverate on unlearnable things like white noise, which is something an information maximizing agent would find interesting, which is a very common notion of curiosity in the AI literature, but not something that animals ever fixate on, or babies even, right? Is an important thing. And ultimately what we want is not just long horizon planning or long range adaptivity, but it's to go beyond our pre-training data in lifelong situations. So you don't just pre-train, fix the weights, and evaluate, but you have these intrinsic goals actually guide actions and updating of that world model.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope you have the answer you needed. Waipul, I hope, yeah, I'm pronouncing your name right as well. Are there any other questions from the audience? Adil, did you have a question?
Yeah, before we can quickly, I think we are about to finish. So if there's a opportunity to ask a quick question, I guess my question is are world models really necessary for general intelligence? I mean, both your papers or the first two themes, they suggest a forward simulation, whether in pixel space or latent space or brain dynamics, that they are crucial. But is this a necessary ingredient for intelligent behavior, or just one of many possible solutions?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So the way I like to think about it is in terms of resource constraints. So in particular, like the brain is a finite object. It deals with a finite set of resources and has to do well in those settings, right? And I think one of the reasons we see so much structure in the brain, kind of like encoded by evolution, for example, which we're basically approximating in backprop with evolution kind of development, right? At this point, right, to efficiently get to the adult state of the animal, is that by the universal approximation theorem, right? All you need really is like a 2-layer MLP. So you don't actually need any structure, right? And in fact, like in principle, right? I think the theory would suggest this too, is that like you could as long as you have the ability to collect tons and tons more data, in principle, you don't need an explicit world model. In fact, I don't think you need even explicit modules. I think you could learn it all with, again, by the universal approximation theorem, with a very unstructured architecture. The trouble is, though, is that in the real world, like in practice, like we're like compute limited, we're resource limited. Everybody is, right? Like at some level, right? So to give an illustration of this, right? Like one of the reasons like folks like at OpenAI are like moving away from just this kind of like large scale pre-training thing is that they can do extrapolation analyses and show that if they were to match the same performance that test time reasoning does, basically the thing I was mentioning about like you want the agents to adapt to new scenarios, in this case, test time reasoning, like in O1 and those sorts of models, the performance gains you get with the same amount of data would require like several orders of magnitude more pre-training data, which is just they already have the whole internet, so it's like well beyond like what they could even scramble to put together. So just to say, like, yes, in principle, I don't think you need any of these, right? I don't think you need modules. I don't think you need structure. It's just in practice, and we need them because it's much more efficient, basically, to get to something like general intelligence with the resources we have. And also, one of the reasons, again, like we see it in the brain, is the brain itself is also constrained, right? There's a certain amount of energy it can use, and a certain finite space that it occupies, right? But even in more unrestricted settings with current AI systems, just for practical engineering purposes, it's not about whether the scaling law holds. It'll always hold. It starts to plateau at some point, but it can get to any point. It's just that where that cutoff is of the x-axis of your resources is the critical thing.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, I was just thinking in terms of the paper that came out day before or yesterday in Nature from Danager about the Dreamer, where they have used the whole model, the training that in the Minecraft game you can pick diamonds without really starting without any data. Yeah, so it's just seems like very powerful, but on the other hand, as you're saying, yeah, seems like yeah, it seems the other way as well. So very interesting.
I mean,
to
give another explicit example, actually in industry, so Tesla, right? Like they can go and collect all kinds of data, right? Like real world data, right? Like they drive their cars and then through the video camera, right, are collecting actually what right now amounts to about a century's worth of data. So they've drastically improved their training with end-to-end learning, with a transformer that predicts the next action, actually. So So data is not the bottleneck fully, right? But we're not getting to performance levels even with a century's worth of data that that we would like to get. Like self-driving cars, of course, have improved greatly over the past 5 to 6 years, but they're still not like beating. In order for them to be like a scalable technology, right? They have to be better than humans are, right? Driving, and so until we get those reaching those error rates, even with a century's worth of video data, is not getting us there. So, it's another reason why, like, I think architectures can be helpful, but paired with learning, totally.
But they've gone to mostly simulation, right? I mean, that's what their whole Dojo supercomputer is. I mean, they're basically taking the exemplars from the data and then, splaying those out across, all sorts of simulation paths.
And so, yeah,
yeah.
and like as a result, like the main bottleneck from what they've said is that it's like a storage issue. Like they can't. A lot of the engineering now actually goes into being able to store all of that data, and like the problem is like video data is very dense, right? So it's just even if you can get there, I think let's say like in principle, right, you get to AGI or whatever, right, or self-driving, okay, with all this data, any company would be incentivized to reduce the load with a more efficient architecture.
I mean, there you go. I mean, of course, we don't store all the video that, right now we are getting a video input. We don't store that. We just store a very low representation of it.
Yeah.
And that's how it works. So I guess,
Yeah.
a lot to be, yeah. Anyway, I guess that's going, far beyond the time we had. So I would just hand it over back to you guys.
Yeah, actually, I don't know how much time. If you have time, Aran, I have also questions,
Yeah.
but yeah, feel free to let me know if you have to leave. The mental pong experiment, I found it really fascinating. I have a question regarding that experiment. How do you map the latent variables from the model to actual neural responses in mechanics? Do you use supervised or unsupervised alignment techniques?
That's an excellent question. So what I do is it's a regression. So it's unlike the vision results that I showed you, where it's like a fixed mapping to temporal averages of IT and V4 responses. What we're doing is actually mapping to the dynamics. So we take the dynamics of it's more fine-grained measures. Like we're not only mapping to like way more neurons than before in like V4 and IT, which is on the order of 128 and 168 or 88 and 168 in V4 and IT. Now it's like 2000, basically close to 2000 DMFC. Is that now we're doing those 2000 neurons, but across time. And what we're also doing is like the latent population vector of the model is also a set of activities across same time points. And so what we do is we train a linear mapping across time. So we share the weights of that linear mapping. And why we do that is that the neurons, in order for it to be like a more physical mapping, one thing you could do is, of course, train a separate linear mapping per time point. But that's too flexible in the sense that it's aphysical, because it's not like the neuron's identity changes each time point, right? It's not like you have different sets of populations each time point. It's the same population. It's just evolving in time. And so that's why we're restricting the weights to be time shared. And so that's how we do it. That's a little bit of a nuance there, but that practice actually came about in the Kanban work originally in 2022, and then it's one I adopt in the context of time dynamics.
I see. Great. Okay. And also, yeah, I just wanted to know, what does object-centric predictions bias over pixel-based or frame-based feature prediction, especially in terms of alignment with brain activity?
Yeah, so I think my hypothesis, at least in that domain, is that the object centricity allows you to generalize better to out of distribution scenes. And like that's sort of the critical kind of thing that the models are failing at, is that despite being trained on lots of scenes, in some way or another, they end up failing on some out of distribution scenario that really they shouldn't. Like you and I have don't really fail on, or humans don't when collected in aggregate. And so I think that's kind of what it buys you. And given that the brain does it, the general principle has been, as you get better at a brain task, like e.g. generalizing to new scenarios, which we know humans already do, there's a high likelihood. The number of solutions, the ways to do that is actually very low because most models can't do that. And so by the kind of contravariance principle, the less solutions there are, but to that problem, and the harder it is, the higher the overlap with the brain solution there will be. It's not guaranteed, but that's one of the reasons why when models that do better on tasks that brains already do well end up matching the brain. So in other words, if you optimize purely for an AI goal of generalizing, you'll likely end up getting a better brain model than what we currently have in what I showed you.
Okay, great. Yeah, I have many more questions. The talk was amazing, and maybe we can continue another time, but I will stop now. But yeah, thanks a lot.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah, I guess thanks everyone. So many people already thanked you for the great talk, but they had to leave. Obviously, they're from all around the world, time zones. Someone said it's 12 a.m. here, and yeah, anyway, some people had to leave. But thanks again, Aran. Thank you so much for being our first speaker. Hopefully, we can keep this going and have you again, or catch up later for more future questions.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was really a pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
Thank
Have
you
a good
so
day.
much. It was nice meeting you.
Nice.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.